we're going to make it snow. It will snow.
They say the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and in one last act of defiance, I thought I'd teach this Weasel a lesson and finish it off with a small winter setting, and along the way check out some road signs, paint a figure, and conjure up a snowstorm. So let's get started. I'd been planning on making a compact scene to showcase this model, and I found a figure that would complement it. Obviously, being a winter environment, the figure needed to be dressed appropriately. This figure is from the body and seemed to fit the bill, although it was a shame the coat was just one big hunk of resin with no undercuts. I began the painting process with a bit of an experiment, and that was to prime the figure in a red primer colour straight from the rattle can. The red tone was an experiment in the hope that it might add some warmth to the paintwork, but ultimately I'll have nothing to compare it against, so take that for what it's worth. The key to a successful figure begins with the face. I place a small amount of acrylic paint in my wet palette and apply that darkest layer of Citadel Bugman's Glow. There are so many different styles and techniques to paint figures, but I approach it from working with my darkest to my lightest tones. I make a mix of Bugman's Glow with Acadian Flesh and apply that in the wet, thin coats, and I'm covering about 90% of the surface area and looking to build on that darkest layer that I've just applied. Round 3 is the straight Acadian Flesh, and you guessed it, working on a reduced surface area again. I'm concentrating on the nose, the forehead, cheekbones and tops of ears and things like that, anywhere where the light might catch the shapes around the face. By keeping the paint and the brush reasonably moist, I can graduate and blend those tones to hopefully get rid of the lines in those graduating colours. I move through more lighter tones, brightening that flesh coloured paint with a mix of Acadian Flesh and Vallejo Light Flesh. And because of the way the eyes had been sculpted, I'm going to rely on an oil wash to bring that sculpt to life. So for now, my work on the face was complete. And just while I'm painting the flesh tones, I'd like to revisit that primer. The value of priming a model is something I've undervalued over the years, but the more I model, the more important I see it as being. A good primer will give you the best foundation to build your paintwork over. It unifies different medias such as putties, photo etch and styrene, and it has the ability to instantly highlight any flaws in your construction. I move to the uniform now and adopt the same techniques I used for the flesh tones, but obviously with the appropriate colours. I'm using the Gen 3 acrylic colours here from a set for World War II US figures. I'm looking to block in my basic colours to start, and the uniform is painted in the darkest green in that set, and that's a dark olive, and the trench coat is treated with a US field drab. I then mix my mid-tones for the green using a mix of that dark olive again, only this time with the US olive uniform base. This mid-dark tone is applied over the parts, but with a reduced coverage. The process is repeated using the straight US olive base and then lightened as I progress and start focusing on the upper edges and folds and details that might catch the light in the sculpt. The key to success is to keep moisture in the paint and build the coverage up gradually with multiple passes, letting each layer dry before you apply the next. The highlights were initially mixed with a Vallejo highlight colour, but it was looking a little blue, so that was corrected by introducing some light flesh into that mix to desaturate that colour. The trench coat was highlighted in the same way as the green tones, only using a colour called Green Ochre Khaki from the set as my mid-tone and then lightening it with a light flesh. Details such as the holster and belt were carefully picked out with a fine brush. I was really happy with my base tones, so it was then time to create some definition over the sculpt with a selective oil wash using shadow brown and flesh shadow. The oil paint is thinned with a white spirit, and a tiny touch is allowed to travel through the contours of the eyes and around the mouth and nose. Refinement is important, however, because it's an oil paint over the acrylic, I can remove it and start again if I'm not happy with the outcome. It can look a little confronting at this stage, but the oils tone down as they dry, so it's possible this technique will need to be applied a couple of times to achieve the look you're after. By lightly adding the shadow brown through the recesses and folds of the sculpt, I can help bring a visual depth to the figure. The wash is selective rather than all over application, and that brown will shift the colour because it's acting as a filter of sorts. So if you wanted to maintain the vibrancy in the colours, you could always use a deep green oil paint for this process, but the shadow brown works pretty well in most scenarios. After the wash had dried, a few additional highlights were added to the holster and the straps, and the handle of the pistol was enhanced using the tip of a lead pencil. An all-over VMS matte varnish not only seals this paintwork, but it also has an uncanny knack of smoothing out the look of the paintwork and the graduations and making it all look more harmonious. I wanted to add some height and scale to this small scene and was lucky enough to be able to review the newly released road sign set from Miniart for the modelling news. I've left a link in the review in the notes there for those of you who are interested in that review. You don't appreciate how valuable these sets are until you want one and you can't get your hands on one. The concrete telegraph pole was just what I was looking for to give me my scale. An assembly was simple as there were only two halves that needed to be glued together. I added some texturing to the surface by mixing a modelling cement and Tamiya putty together and stippling it over the part using an old brush. This technique is great for simulating the look of the cast texture in some metals, however it's also handy to represent the look of poured concrete. Once the putty had had time to dry, a light sand smoothed the texture somewhat and presented the concrete surface in a more realistic way. Mr. Surfacer Grey seemed an appropriate colour for that concrete colour, with the supports and insulators sprayed in an iron colour from Tamiya and the details painted using a fine brush and acrylic paints. The kit requires the blades for the road signs to be painted in white. This is noted on the instructions on the back of the box, and this is because there is no white primer printed on that Decals sheet. So to use anything other than white would have a detrimental effect on the look of that road sign. This is because they're printed using a 4-colour process with no white primer. This process relies on the white foundation to reflect the white and present the prints as they were intended. Hence, I need to paint the blades in white to allow the decals to present properly. Once the white had dried, the decals could be fitted by first wetting the blade with a setting solution. And once the decal was in the correct position, a coating of a softening solution was applied to help it settle in place. Working the decal with a Q-tip can help move all of that moisture from underneath it and help to set you up for a successful application. You can see it settling through that timber grain from the sign blade. 24 hours later and the parts were sealed with a varnish straight from the rattle can, and I could move to painting the back sides of the blades using a combination of browns and grey acrylic paints. I can't really give you a formula here because I was making it up as I went. Trying to paint in a random nature is harder than it sounds. I referenced images of old timber sign blades and tried to mirror the look in the plastic parts. I created splits, grains and knots using a fine brush and a black-grey colour. In saying that, I saw Uncle Nightshift absolutely nail creating a timber look using oil paints in his last video, so if you haven't seen that, I can highly recommend checking it out. Much easier than how I approached mine. I added further distress to some of the sign blades by cutting into the edges with a scalpel and making it look like splintered timber. Once dry, a superglue is used to hold the sign blades in place on the pole. The assembly was treated to my favourite post-shading technique. This is achieved with a mix of red, brown and black, thin to around 90% thinner to paint. I'm concentrating the coverage around recessed and shadow areas, but I can also create a subtle streaking effect that is often seen on deteriorating concrete. I then create streaking to simulate rust streaks and rain runoff using a dot of oil paint and my deconstructed flat brush, or as one of my Patreons, Lysander, calls it, my buggered brush. And while on Patreon, welcome to my latest killer kangaroos: Robert Burnside of Red Beach One Studios, Jonathan Willis, Jake McKee and Steve Opie. Thank you guys for choosing to become part of this community. I'm truly grateful for the support and your input that you are providing, and of course a big thank you to my Wombat Warriors. Remember, Patreon is free to join, so be sure to connect with our community over on that page, and there you can select the tier that works best for you. A small circular base was plundered from an old build. The edges were taped and the groundwork was built up using VMS Smart Mud. The Smart Mud is a textured mud paste that is easily applied over the base and presents in a realistic way. It's far less wet than the terrains paste you may have seen me use previously, hence I've chosen to use it for this application. The material can be manipulated and sculpted in a way to create ruts and divots, as well as imprint tracks and tire marks in it. I press the elements into that mud paste before it has dried to mark where everything will sit. After 24 hours, I'm able to drill into the base and glue a small brass rod in to help locate the telegraph pole and hold it more sturdily in place.
Hey, it's snowing!
Time to make it snow, and the mix using the AK snow sprinkles and the baking soda in that 50-50 mix is concocted, just like I did for the model itself. The snow paste was then applied around the base using a spatula and a soft brush soaked in water. The powdered baking soda was then sprinkled over that wet mix, and someone from the Workbench Hobbies community suggested the baking soda may yellow over time, and this is something I hadn't really considered, so I guess time will tell, but I'm reasonably confident it will be okay as it's somewhat suspended in that acrylic paste mix. The vehicle is set in its final destination, and the groundscape is enhanced with a few pieces of foliage I had in the stash. The foliage is kept to a minimum given the frozen nature of this setting, however, they do add an element of interest and imply some life finding its way through that snow cover. The figure is glued in place and the tape removed, and the base was ready for inspection. Isn't it interesting how our projects and the subjects we choose to model evolve over time? I try to set myself a build schedule and start off with all the good intentions, only to find my attention and focus being shifted at any given moment. That's exactly what happened in this case, when one session at the modelling bench saw me reaching for the Weasel, and the rest is history. In saying that, it can mean you end up with something completely unplanned, and there is this sense of surprise and satisfaction that comes with that. I think that's what keeps modelling interesting for me. It's a sense of unpredictability and that ability to flip-flop between projects. It keeps me interested, motivated and engaged. The downside is I have a stack of half-built kits in the stash, but hey, they're my models and I'll waste them if I want to, right? Mind you, I have had to be a little more disciplined since I've started this channel, but occasionally I'll sneak something unexpected through, so hopefully it keeps it interesting for you guys too. But what do you guys think, and how do your projects evolve? Do you flip-flop between subjects? Or are you one of those select few that can see a model out from start to finish without being tempted by the next shiny thing? I'd love to know, so please let me know in the comments down below. If I've added some value today, please remember to hit that like button and be sure that you are subscribed. This channel needs your help to grow, and those couple of little clicks will mean that you've played your part in helping me connect with an even greater audience, and that is good for everyone. If all goes to plan, I'll have something a little different for you for my next project, but let's not make any promises here because, like I've said, I do have a tendency to be easily distracted. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
Let it snow, let it snow, let it snow.